Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the annual Diller Lecture, the Helen Diller's Distinguished Lecture in Jewish Studies. Every year, we honor Helen Diller, whose generous endowment continues to provide crucial support to Jewish studies at UC Santa Cruz by hosting a public lecture on campus by an internationally renowned scholar. And this year, we have as our internationally renowned scholar, Gershom Gorenberg. Gershom Gorenberg is a Washington Post columnist and author, most recently of War of Shadows, Codebreakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. Gershom previously wrote 3 critically acclaimed books on Israel's history and politics: The Unmaking of Israel, The Accidental Empire, Israel and the Birth of the Settlements, 1967 to 1977, and The End of Days, Fundamentalism and the Struggle for the Temple Mount. He co-authored Shalom Friend, a biography of Yitzhak Rabin and winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Gershom teaches an intensive workshop on writing history each spring semester at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. As a commentator on Middle East affairs, he has appeared on 60 Minutes, Nightline, Fresh Air, and on CNN and on BBC. He has written for The Atlantic Monthly, The New York Times Magazine, The New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, Prospect Magazine, The National, and in Hebrew for Haaretz. Gershom has lived in Jerusalem since 1977, and he graduated from UCSC in 1976. Before getting started, I just have one. So I wanted to thank a few people before. We can clap again in a moment. I just wanted to thank the THI for their support in putting this event together. So thank you so much for that. And then a note of housekeeping: when we get to the Q&A, there are going to be some microphones passed around. So when you want to have the microphone, just raise your hand and wait for someone to bring you the microphone so you can ask your question at the end. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Gershom Gorenberg.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Alma and to the Center for Jewish Studies and for the Humanities Institute and to Bruce Thompson, and I could go on with the list, but I won't. But I just want to say that it's 48 years since I wrote my first paper on Mideast history for a course at UC Santa Cruz, and I cannot possibly describe to you how mind-boggled, humbled, and honored I am to be back here speaking to you. And before I get into the actual subject matter, I also want to say that researching that paper, looking for ever more obscure sources, I got my first sense of what became an obsession and a joy, which is that beneath each well-known piece of history, there is another story. It might be hidden in long classified documents or in papers that men and women brought home from a war and left in their attics for their grandchildren to discover only when I phoned them. It might be secreted in unpublished memoirs written by women whose entire generation was widowed by that war. But what has been told so many times that it is bright and definite and unambiguous may turn out to be a coded message from the past waiting to be deciphered. And for the students among you, I truly hope that I can pass on that obsession to some of you. So when I started working on the War of Shadows, I told people that I was writing about the war in the Middle East. And I got quizzical looks like, which one? The Gulf War, Syria, the Six-Day War? And I said, World War II. And then the looks grew even more quizzical because all of this underlined what my book editor said when he got the manuscript, which is, the way he put it is, American memory of the war against Germany tends to leap from Pearl Harbor to D-Day to we won. And yet, for 3 years, from 1940 to 1943, more than half the war, North Africa was the front where British and then Allied forces fought Italy and Germany. And that stage of the conflict was crucial to the outcome of the war and created the Middle East that we know. And not only that, the real story of the decisive battle is the story of an intelligence breakthrough, and it's either missing or fragmentary in accounts of the war. The heroes have been erased, and not by accident. So to understand this, I want to take you on time travel. This is one of those guided tours that hops from one landmark to another, and in this case, from one date to another, so please stay with the guide. Our first stop is Cairo, Central Cairo, downtown Cairo, on the 1st of July, 1942. This is what it looks like. If you're at that cafe, If you're among the department stores and apartment buildings of a city that was built to be the Paris of the Middle East, and you look west toward the Nile, you will see pillars of smoke rising from British General Headquarters of the Middle East, from the British Embassy, from the Royal Air Force Headquarters, from the Special Operations Executive Office, which is the secret agency that supports resistance in Nazi-occupied countries, because clerks and soldiers are burning papers. They're burning code books and plans and maps and orders, and the fire is so hot that some of the documents don't burn, they float up on the hot air, and secret documents are literally raining over Cairo. And if you want to take cash out of the bank, which you want to do, you will find lines down the block, and that the tellers are handing out worn-out bills because they've run out of fresh bills. And there are also long lines outside of shops selling suitcases. That morning, a 19-year-old British code officer named June Watkins got off her shift in the basement of a downtown hotel, and she met a South African officer who took her to a place called Gropey's Garden Cafe for coffee. It was a favorite hangout for British and Allied officers. And the garden was closed. They had to sit inside. So she went into the lady room and she looked out into the garden, and what she saw was waiters are painting signs in German welcoming the officers of Erwin Rommel's army. And like other officers, she's now carrying a pistol. The lesson earlier that week for women code officers on pistol use included instructions on how to shoot themselves, because women who knew codes were not to fall into enemy hands. The Cairo train station, well, if you've seen the movie Casablanca and you remember the scene from the Paris train station the day before Paris fell, without the rain, that's what the Cairo train station looked like. It's packed with people who are trying to get on trains to flee south to Sudan or to get on the overnight train to Palestine. The British Army reserves 1,600 seats for civilians who are in danger because they worked for the British. That includes 100 Italian and German Jewish refugees who had worked as translators or agents. But the British authorities in Palestine don't want to let them in because the 1939 white paper drastically limited Jewish immigration to Palestine. So there was a special operations executive officer who was an Italian-speaking Jew from Alexandria, and he started ferrying some of these Jews on the list of Palestine in his car, a 12-hour journey across the desert, and the authorities in Palestine said, you have to go back. At this point, one of the Italian Jews that he had brought tried to kill himself in Palestine rather than return to Cairo, and at last the authorities relented and said, these people are allowed temporary refuge as long as they promise not to stay permanently. The Turkish Embassy radios Ankara and says, the embassy is full of Jews who want visas. What should we do? And they get an answer from Ankara that says, tell them no. Do not give any immigration visas to these people. Why are we seeing these Turkish radiograms in English? Because they were intercepted and decoded and translated by GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, which was a British agency whose very existence was unknown to the public. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, you saw, well, a highly inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke Enigma. They also broke the diplomatic codes of 24 countries, by the way, including the United States. Everyone knew that Cairo was about to face the same fate as Paris, as Belgrade, as Warsaw, etc. And this map should help you to understand the reason. 10 days earlier, if you look at where the red arrow is, the German and Italian army under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had conquered the little port town of Tobruk in eastern Libya. The British army appears to be on the edge of collapse, and in just 10 days, Rommel's army advances 350 miles to a spot in the desert called El Alamein. That's where the red circle is, just west of Alexandria. Let's stop for a moment and discuss this guy, Rommel. He is probably the most famous of the German generals. He's always pictured like this with his captured British sand goggles on his cap to show that he's the master of the desert. In World War II, he became the avatar, the personification of blitzkrieg, of fast mobile warfare. Churchill himself in Parliament in January 1942 said, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent, a great general," referring to Rommel. General Claude Auchinleck, who was Britain's commander in the Middle East, gave orders to stop referring to the enemy as Rommel because it made soldiers think that he had supernatural powers, which hurt morale. We must refer to the Germans or the Axis powers or the enemy, Auchinleck commanded, to absolutely no avail. Everybody went on referring to Rommel. In the British Army and in Egypt, the Axis advance was almost universally attributed to Rommel's military genius, including his apparently supernatural ability to predict British moves. He seemed to read the minds of British commanders. He later wrote, and soon afterwards wrote a memoir of his time in North Africa, which was called War Without Hate, portraying the war as just soldiers in a particularly deadly sport, which completely ignored the fact that there were civilians who lived in Libya and Egypt and Tunisia and were just as much affected by this war as civilians in Europe. The post-war story that grew around Rommel was that he was a good German, which in part comes out of the fact that he committed suicide after allegedly having taken part in the coup bid against Hitler. I stress the word allegedly. So keep in mind the name Rommel, but remember, we're in the summer of 1942. If you look at the map again, where the blue arrow is, that's Jerusalem, and what you can see is the distance from El Alamein to Jerusalem is barely more than the distance from Tobruk to El Alamein. So the expectation in Palestine among Jews and Arabs was simply, Rommel is coming. And for Jews in particular, this was frightening, but the meaning, I want to stress, was unclear. On the one hand, just a few days earlier, in late June of 1942, a report was published in London, the first such clear report, which said that information smuggled out of occupied Europe was that 700,000 Jews had been murdered in Poland, including some who had been murdered in mobile gas chambers. With information gathered from elsewhere in occupied Europe, the World Jewish Congress reported that 1 million Jews had been murdered in Nazi-occupied Europe so far. This is how that story appeared in the New York Times on the 30th of June, 1942, on page 7 next to the Saks Fifth Avenue ads. The usual interpretation of why this story appeared here is completely wrong. It is not because the editors of the New York Times were not concerned about Jews or didn't care about their being murdered. It's because this story was highly doubtful. In fact, the Hebrew newspaper Hatzofet in Tel Aviv published an editorial the same day saying, these items come as rumors taken from the air, passed from one informant to another, one writer to another. It said it was completely irresponsible for news agencies to publish these numbers. Clearly something bad was happening to Jews in occupied Europe, but this was, these were fantasies that only caused despair. So for the 75,000 Jews in Egypt and the 500,000 more in Palestine, the fear of Rommel does not match the full threat. What they don't know is that the SS is so confident of victory that it has already created an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing group for the Middle East. And on the same day that Rommel reaches El Alamein, July 1st, 1942, the commander is appointed. His name is Walter Rauf, and he was previously in charge of the production of the mobile gas chambers, in which by the end of the war, it would turn out an estimated 500,000 or more Jews were murdered in Eastern Europe in the course of the war. Rauf's orders were to carry out executive measures against the Jews of Egypt, and once Rommel advanced, the targets will be the Jews of Palestine, and after that of Syria and Lebanon and the 100,000 Jews in Iraq. Executive measures, you can figure out what that means. So on July 1st, 1942, Egypt and the Middle East are on the verge of falling to the Nazis, and everything depends on what happens at a completely desolate spot where the desert meets the sea called El Alamein. In order to understand what happened at El Alamein, we need to get back on our time machine, and we're going to go back nearly 3 years to the first week of 1939 and to the train tracks of Poland. And we're going to look at 2 trains. One is entering Poland and one is leaving. The first train left Berlin on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion, headed into Poland, and it's Hitler's private train. He wants to see the conquest in progress. And in charge of his security is his favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel proudly writes to his wife that he'd been invited to sit next to Hitler at lunch and that he, Rommel, quote, was allowed to chat for almost 2 hours, unquote, with Hitler about military problems. He writes, quote, he is extraordinarily friendly towards me, unquote. Rommel worships Hitler. At the same time, the SS and Gestapo chief Reinhard Heydrich tells the military intelligence chief of Germany, Wilhelm Canaris, quote, "The nobility, the Catholic clergy, and the Jews must be killed," unquote. We have similar testimony about Nazi plans from an officer serving under General Franz Halder, chief of the army staff. The officer wrote in his diary that some of what he heard from Halder about what was planned for Germany was too awful to write down. So I leave it to you to consider whether Rommel did or did not know the meaning of German victories. Rommel, in any case, was elated to watch the invasion of Poland. It fit his ideas of rapid warfare, of armored divisions breaking through enemy defenses. But to carry out this kind of warfare, tanks were not the only machine needed, because headquarters needed to be in touch with the heads of the tank forces, who needed to be in contact with the units under them. And they're moving. And the only way to do this by radio is by radio. But if you send battle plans by radio, you're shouting them out to the world. Or as historian John Ferris has written, quote, "Only a traitor used radio, only a fool did not." That was the dilemma. So what you had to do is you had to encrypt those messages. But traditional codes and ciphers were too easy to break. A code is a random group of letters or numbers for each word. Say, ZOBEQ could mean tank, or 67149 could mean London. And the code book is essentially a two-sided dictionary, say, has 50,000 words. With each word, there's such a random group. One half is words with the code next to them, the other is the code group with the words. What are the risks with codes? Well, the first risk is what's called physical compromise, which does not mean what some people think espionage is about. It means it's stolen or captured. But also a skilled code breaker with an idea of what the message is about finds repeats and other clues and can gradually reconstruct the code book. Besides that, it's really slow to use. You have to keep looking in that code book. It's not an effective method for a battlefield. The faster way is to use a cipher, which is to say each letter is replaced by a different letter. The classic problem with the cipher is that, say, if Z is the most common letter in the enciphered message, then you know that it's E. And you just start working your way down the frequency table, and with a long enough message, you're sure to be able to break it. What if the cipher were different for every letter? What if you typed EEE and it came out as TZQ or something else, on and on, seemingly randomly? So the solution, the way to do this, was a machine put on the market in the 1920s, originally for business use by a Berlin company, and that machine was the Enigma. You see a keyboard, behind it is a light board arranged the same as the keyboard. Behind each of those little lights, which just looks like a bump in the picture, is a letter of the alphabet. And behind that are three wheels. Each wheel has 26 electrical contacts on each side and wires connecting them inside. But the pattern is hidden. Which contact on which side is connected to which contact on the other side? Contact number 1 can be connected to any of the 26 on the other side, and contact number 2 to any of the remaining 25, and so on and so forth. So if you press, say, the letter B, the signal, pressing the key sends an electrical pulse through the wiring of all three wheels, back through them again, and then to the light board, and any letter but B will light up. But as you press the key, the wheels also turn, and the pattern changes. So if you press B again, something else is going to come up. The clerk takes down what lights up and sends that message by radio. In 1926, the German Navy adopted Enigma, then the Army, then the Air Force. The beauty of the device was, first of all, it was the size of a typewriter. It weighed 15 pounds. You could carry it in the officer's command car. To decipher the message, all you had to do was type the encrypted message back into another Enigma machine, and the clear text would light up on the light board. If, let me underline, put in capital letters and in red the word if you have another machine whose wheels are wired the same way, and you know all of the starting positions. The number of possible settings, the number of starting positions, is 150 quintillion. That's the small number. The number of possible ways that the wheels can be wired is this: 5 times 10 to the 92nd. It is completely obvious to everybody on both sides that no one could possibly ever test this many combinations, that there is no machinery that can do this, that there is no mathematical solution. This is, as we would say today, absolutely secure end-to-end encryption. But as I said, we're going to look at 2 trains on those Polish tracks. The second train left Warsaw on September 6, 1939, heading east away from the German forces, and on board was the man who ultimately can be said to have defeated Rommel. His name was Marian Ryujski. He was 34 years old. 10 years earlier, while working on his master's degree in math, he was recruited by Polish military intelligence's Cipher Bureau. And in autumn of 1932, he was assigned to break Enigma. He applied a branch of mathematics called permutation theory. I am not going to claim that I understand everything about permutation theory, but I understand enough of it to know that somebody looking at the problem today would say, of course you use permutation theory. That was obvious to Marian Ryujski and to nobody else. In January of 1933, he calculated the wiring of the Enigma machines. And then he and 2 assistants found ways to find the settings and started reading German Enigma messages. But as the war approaches, the Germans went from changing the settings every 3 months to every month to every day, and Ryujski and his 2 assistants couldn't keep up. In July of 1939, they invited 2 British cryptologists, 2 British codebreakers from GCHQ to Warsaw and shared their work. In September of 1939, on that train, Ryujski escaped via Romania and reached France, where he continued to advise the British. The best British codebreakers never believed that Ryujski figured out the wiring on his own. That was impossible. They assumed that the Poles had succeeded in stealing an Enigma machine, and that's how they did it. But all of the British work on Enigma was based on Ryujski's success in breaking the absolutely secure Enigma cipher. It changed the entire course of the war. To understand that, we need to travel again. We're going to England now. It's the same date still. We're at the beginning of September 1939. We're going to the place known as Bletchley Park, which is this absolutely hideous mansion in the countryside between Cambridge and Oxford. And that's where GCHQ has set up its wartime headquarters. Among the people moving in is a name that you may recognize, is Alan Turing, the Cambridge mathematician. Yes, he was very eccentric. The fact that he was sent on delicate missions to parallel agencies in France and the United States casts some doubt on the popular picture of him as emotionally out of touch, as for instance in The Imitation Game. Based on Ryujski's work, he designed a giant machine that ran through Enigma settings looking for one that it could have produced for a particular text. For this to work, you needed to have a good idea of a text that was likely to appear in the message. For instance, let's say this is what you intercepted, TINLZ, et cetera, 4 groups of 5 letters stuck together. You guess that what this means really is the text written underneath it in red, which actually is the text written underneath that in black, which means nothing to report in Germany. Why are they in groups of 5? One of the ways to hide the words is simply that you ignore the original spacing and everything goes in groups of 5. And the code at the other end, you reconnect them to make words. So you're pretty sure that this is real. There was a particular station that every couple of hours there was an officer who sent out the message, nothing to report, because he was in a very quiet spot. So you set up Turing's giant machine to look for the setting that could possibly have made TINLZ, or could possibly make nothing to report into those letters at the top. Another person moving in there was another Cambridge mathematician, a colleague of Turing's named Gordon Welchman, theorio-academician. Besides coming up with the design change that made Turing's machine actually work, Welchman's really big idea was that code breaking wasn't academic work. It wasn't for a genius sitting alone in a room. He proposed turning it into an industry. You would divide research on new versions of Enigma from the daily work of finding the settings. The code breakers would work 3 shifts a day. The translators would work 3 shifts a day. Bletchley Park went from a staff of about 100 when the war began to thousands. It was, before the term was invented, a technological startup. And Welchman discovered that he was a manager, a mover, a problem solver, and never returned to academia. First, with the help of the Poles in Paris, Bletchley Park begins finding Enigma settings and reading messages. This isn't a one-time break. You need to break the settings for each day and for each network. And then you need to translate in them and make sense. And then you need to keep the source secret while convincing the highest commanders that you are daily reading the inner workings of the German military. This is a terrible problem. This is like the dilemma of intelligence. It's only useful if you can get it to people to use who can use it. And the more people you tell, the less likely it is to remain secret. And if you tell them what the source is, that could get out. But if you don't tell them what the source is, why should they believe it? Okay. Back in our time machine, we're moving to September 1940 and back to North Africa. 3 months after joining the war on the German side, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini decides to realize his goal of creating a new Roman Empire and orders his completely reluctant commander in the Italian colony of Libya to invade Egypt. From this point on, the Mediterranean, and especially North Africa, is the main front on which Britain and its dominions fight the Axis. The British, that's the little blue arrow, is the Italian invasion. The British counterattack in December 1940. That's the red arrow. As you can see, they went much further. They got to Benghazi and beyond. They took the entire eastern half of Libya, which is known as Cyrenaica. And in February of 1941, Hitler decides that he has to intervene in Libya lest the Italians lose the country and the British threaten Nazi-occupied Europe from the south. So he sends his favorite general, Rommel, with 2 German divisions. Rommel's orders are to stop the British advance. Defense. He's told, you don't have trucks to supply an advance. What happens? Rommel, as Rommel does, ignores orders and gambles. He was, in fact, his personality was that of a compulsive gambler, and each victory convinced him that the odds did not apply to him, and especially that other generals' concerns about logistics and supply lines are foolish. He attacks, he retakes Benghazi and most of eastern Libya. It looks brilliant. The reality is that the British commander in the Mediterranean theater had just moved his best forces to Greece in a failed attempt to stop the German conquest of Greece. This pattern repeats itself in the fall of 1941 and 1942. The British attack, they take Cyrenaica. Rommel counterattacks, takes Benghazi. Again, it looks brilliant. The reality is that after Pearl Harbor, which the Japanese attack was not just on Pearl Harbor, but on British colonies in the Pacific, including Hong Kong and Singapore, the British had moved troops and warplanes from the Middle East to the Far East, and Rommel has this victory, and the Rommel legend grows. Mussolini decides the reason that the Axis forces in Libya keep having these problems is obviously it's the Jews' fault. I mean, what else could it be? So in a decree of February 1942, he orders that all of the Jews of Libya, some 33,000 Jews, will be expelled to a concentration camp in the desert, starting with those of eastern Libya. There's roundups, there's a 5-day journey in trucks in the open desert. It goes slowly because the transporting of the Jews, because they need trucks to fuel and supply the army. And yet, even with those military needs, some trucks are put aside for the terribly important mission of sending Jews to concentration camp. The camp, called Jado, the Jews were fed 100 to 150 grams of bread a day total, were subjected to forced labor. At one point, some of the inmates actually asked the commander for more food, and the commander replied, "We didn't bring you here to keep you alive, we just didn't want to waste bullets on you." The reality is, people lived in the Middle East, in Benghazi, in Tobruk, in Derna. People lived there, they suffered bombings, they suffered destruction and death, they suffered what happened in Europe as well. And the Axis aspiration is to conquer the Middle East, and wherever the Axis was directly or indirectly in control, there was an immediate threat to the Jewish population. Back on our time machine. We're going to move forward to April 1942. In Africa, the British and Axis troops are facing each other on a front in eastern Libya, each preparing to attack. At Bletchley Park, in the English countryside, Welchman's crew finally breaks into the Enigma network used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters, and this message is decoded. It says that reported from a good source, those are the words, a good source. By the way, there's no everything goes in capital letters in these messages, so you don't know what's a proper noun and what isn't. It says that according to a good source, they're going, the British cannot attack until June 1st, and that will be too late. Too late for what isn't said. Sorry, just a moment. But this is actually an incredible message because it's telling what British plans are. It's essentially a message to Rommel that if you attack before June 1st, you will have the advantage of preempting the British. It is sent to the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story, who had been recruited 2 years before at the rank of untrained clerk to Bletchley Park. It transformed her life. Because what happened was the British success at decrypting German messages was getting into the nightmares of the commanders of Bletchley Park. What are they deciphering of our messages? If we're breaking theirs, what if they're breaking ours? So in the spring of 1942, Margaret Story was made a research specialist in charge of finding enemy intelligence in decoded Enigma messages. I wish I could show you a picture, but Margaret left almost no trace in her life but her reports. It took me many, many months to find people who had known her. What they told me is picture her as slight, wearing dark cardigans, always smoking, as, these are words that they used, self-effacing, introspective, very intelligent, daunting intelligence, absolutely formidable intelligence, shy, very shy, the brain. She spoke 9 languages. She had a sense of humor, which she only showed in documents that were labeled top secret. More messages followed citing a good source. This is one of Margaret Story's reports. It tells British positions, plans, and mistakes. One such message is a message that was sent in the 12th of June, 1942, of British commandos intending to attack aircraft on 9 Axis air bases on the night of the 12th of June. The context for this was that there's the island of Malta, which is located between Tunisia and Sicily, was British held, and it was the base for Royal Air Force attacks on Axis shipping, and it was under intense blockade and bombing and short on fuel and arms and food. People were starving there. And the British were planning a convoy from Alexandria and wanted to prevent the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, from attacking the ships, and they planned commando raids on German air bases in Libya. The good source warning alerted the air bases, the commando raids failed, the convoy failed. These few sentences doomed the commandos, sailors on the convoy, and made the situation in Malta more precarious. Rommel's sixth sense, his supernatural ability, is in fact the best intelligence source the Axis had during World War II. And at Bletchley Park, they need to know who or what is the good source. In retrospect, looking at the information that was available, the clues included, the possible suspects, included Laszlo Almasi, or a spy rather, brought to Egypt by Laszlo Almasi. Almasi was a Hungarian desert explorer and German intelligence officer who was extremely heavily fictionalized in the book and film The English Patient. The Almasi you met in The English Patient is not the Almasi of real life. But this is the Almasi of real life in the desert. Or perhaps the source is King Farouk of Egypt, 22 years old, known for his pro-Axis leanings, learned in advance of the British invasion of Persia in 1941 and warned Germany. In February 1942, the British ambassador in Egypt led a coup to force Farouk to appoint a pro-Allied prime minister in Egypt, but Farouk is still king. Maybe he's funneling information. Or maybe the real source is that the Germans are reading a British code which they stole from a British embassy before the war. Just before the war, MI6, that's the British Human Intelligence Agency, their counterintelligence chief, Major Valentine Vivian, wrote scathing reports about the security at the British Embassy in Berlin, saying the Gestapo could introduce nightly and for practically unlimited period each night any number of locksmiths and experts in safe breaking. So perhaps the Germans have stolen a British code. Who was the good source? Not everything. Let's leave the mystery for the book. I asked beforehand if I should give spoilers, and I was told I'll leave out the spoiler. But Let's jump forward to June 21st, 1942. Rommel has just taken Tobruk. His orders are to advance to the Egyptian border and to stop. But this message comes from the good source in Cairo. And it says, if Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, this is a suitable moment. You've got an impeccable intelligence source telling a compulsive gambler that this is the bet that you are going to win. Rommel demands new orders. Even before he gets them, he invades Egypt, and what he desperately needs to do is he needs to get to Alexandria in order to have a port to receive supplies. He actually needs to get beyond Alexandria to Palestine, to take the Royal Air Force bases there to stop air attacks on that shipping. The good source tells him that the British will mount their defense of Egypt at a little place on the coast where the red arrow is, called Mersa Matruh, about halfway across from the Libyan border to Alexandria. Precisely at this moment is when the British succeeded in silencing the good source. How, again, I will leave that for the book. I will only tell you that it took a lot of detective work to figure out that this was the moment. But the reason that this moment matters so much is that on June 25th, General Claude Auchinleck, the head of Britain's Middle East Command, changes the defensive plan and decides the defense will be held at the main defensive line will be at El Alamein, which is indeed a desolate spot in the desert, but it's at the narrowest point between the Mediterranean coast and cliffs that descend to what's known as the Katara Depression, a lowland that is impassable by tanks. This is the narrow spot. There is no way to go around the British line. There is also no good source intelligence from Cairo. Rommel is clueless. He's driving blind. On June 30th, these are again decrypted Enigma messages, the medical officer of his army issues instructions for what to do when you get to the Egyptian cities. Don't drink the water, don't buy the ice cream. They're going to be there right away. On July 1st, Rommel reaches El Alamein, and his messages say that he's expecting to mop up a little strong point there and pursue the British eastward toward Alexandria and Cairo. Instead, he meets a surprise defense. His attacks are blocked by units he didn't even know existed. There's weeks of fighting. He can't advance. His supply lines, the trucks bringing him his supply lines, stretch all the way back to Libya, to Tobruk, to Benghazi, to Tripoli. Every gallon of gas takes another gallon of gas to bring to his tanks if the truck is not bombed on the way by British planes. On the 20th of July, while this battle is raging, Walter Rauff flies from Greece to Tobruk to El Alamein to meet Rommel's chief of staff. And he's told, this is the head of the SS unit, he's told, our advance on Cairo has to wait. We're a little short on supplies, especially fuel. Your guys should wait in Athens until we conquer Egypt. It never happens. El Alamein was literally the line in the sand. It took until November until the British, under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery, drove the Axis forces back and began the British advance across Africa. And Churchill, in a famous speech, would call that battle in October and November the end of the beginning of the war. But I would argue that the real end of the beginning was July. Once Rommel was stopped short of Alexandria, his army was doomed. There is a constant stream of deciphered Enigma messages that show that his army was short of fuel, food, and supplies. He can't reach Alexandria, and Hitler will not give him permission to retreat. Auchinleck's defense worked because the codebreakers cracked Enigma, because Bletchley Park figured out who the good source was, because at the crucial moment, the Axis lost the best source they had in World War II. The victory in the secret war was the key to the victory at El Alamein, and Rommel and the SS under Rauff never reached Cairo. Rommel, of course, also never knew of the role of Ryujski, of Welchman, of Turing, or of Margaret's story in his defeat. So why did this story remain hidden? Well, just before VE Day, on the 19th of April, 1945, an order went out to everyone who knew about the secret of breaking Enigma. And the order was, you may never speak about this for the rest of your life. There's several reasons given in the order, which I found in the, like much of this material in the British National Archives. But the first and the most important reason was, no possible excuse must be given to the Germans to explain away their complete defeat by force of arms. After World War I, there had been all these German conspiracy theories, knife in the back, etc. If it had just been a military confrontation, we would have won. At this point, the British fear was of Germany rising again from the ashes to threaten Europe, and the secret could not be given away. If the psychological defeat of Germany was to be complete, they could not know that part of the reason was breaking their codes. So those who fought the War of Shadows were told, essentially, you played an extraordinary role in the victory, and for the victory to last, you must be forgotten. Some closing thoughts. Historians are meant to avoid what-ifs. I can't tell you what would have happened if Germany had conquered the Middle East in 1942, but it's clear that the course of the war was different and that the region would be very different today. Second thing is, Enigma, unbreakable Enigma, could be broken because human beings designed it, and because one other human being could look at the problem differently. And also because people, human beings, took shortcuts. People repeated phrases, they got careless. The flaw in the machine was the people who used it. Technology has changed greatly since then, but people haven't. Therefore, perfect security keeps failing. Another point, there is no such thing as a war without hate, and there was certainly no such war in North Africa. The Nazis specifically not only intended, but actively took steps to extend the genocide to the Middle East. The borders of the Holocaust were the lines where Allied armies stopped the German advance, and one of those lines was Alamein. If it weren't for the victory at Alamein, the SS would have reached Cairo and Palestine, and that is one part, there's more in my book, of the picture of the Holocaust being in Europe as being much too narrow of a picture. The poet, the Israeli poet Chaim Guri, was 18 at the time of this battle and living in Palestine. We had our last conversation when he was 91. He spoke of the soldiers who fought at Alamein, and he said, you owe your life to nameless people and you don't know where to find them. Even more nameless were those who broke the code. I hope to have honored those forgotten heroes, and if you want to know more, I hope you enjoy reading the full story. Thank you very much. I will be happy to try to answer or evade your questions. I had a history teacher years ago who said there's a lot of history, so I have to speak quickly, so.
Hello. Hi, thank you for the presentation in the book. I was wondering when you first became interested in this topic at all, and if it was so classified that they couldn't talk about it, when did it become unclassified that you could even write this book, with the British saying that they couldn't speak about it? So, yeah.
Those are two great questions. One is, when did I become interested in it, and when did information start coming out? Those are two separate questions. When I became interested in it was at a Shabbat lunch in 2013. And my friend Danny, who unfortunately is no longer around, but my friend Danny happened to mention that his father, a Palestinian Jew, had been an officer in the British Army, and that the British Army wanted his mother to leave for South Africa, that they were evacuating the families of officers because of the danger to Palestine. Now, I knew enough history of the region to know that there had been like this Axis threat, but I hadn't, until that moment, grasped just how immediate people felt it to be. And as I started talking to people and looking at things, I realized that, wow, this was really close. Like, this was like I said, you know, if you were in Cairo, or for that matter in Jerusalem, you felt the way people did right before Paris fell. So I started looking into it, and while I looked into it, I began to find these little mentions of this good source affair, which turned out to be fragmentary and largely incorrect because they were based on information that was available when those accounts were written, which was incomplete, which brings us to your second question. So somewhere in the 70s, the first reports started getting published of breaking Enigma outside of England, in France and in Poland. And that led eventually to permission in Britain to write about it, but the papers were all still secret. So the first books written about it are really a mess because they're based on memory of people who were looking through a keyhole at their little part of the thing. The first book that came out that revealed that Enigma had been broken is so wrong, but it did reveal that Enigma had been broken, which I am told that German officers who were still alive at the time completely refused to believe. Because Enigma is absolutely secure end-to-end encryption. But eventually, documents started getting declassified, some in the 90s, some in the aughts. Some of the stuff I looked at had only been declassified as late as 2013. It's possible, that since my last visit to the archives, more has been declassified. One of the main things that was declassified were actual decoded messages, but also, for instance, Margaret Story's reports, this incredible, and some stuff that is only important once you know the other story, like lists of personnel that allowed me to find out what rank Margaret Story was hired at and the insanely low salary that she was paid, in part because women were paid 60% of what men were paid because they didn't really need salaries, which was also in these documents, which were all secret because they were about GCHQ. And the logbook of communications between the British code breakers and the American code breakers, which included this long distance conversation, which in our terms was sort of like text messages, these brief messages which always created the wrong impression about they're reading, they're finding out this information. Do you know what the source is? Going back and forth between Washington and Bletchley Park, which were all decoded 50, 60, 70 years, declassified 50, 60, 70 years after the war. That was a major source of information. The biggest single source for me was the British archives, but there was also material in smaller archives in England, at Oxford, at Cambridge, at the Imperial War Museum. There was material that came from the American National Archives, which unfortunately are not as well organized as the British. If there's one thing that British do well, it's organizing an archive of 1,000 years of history. Some of the documents were literally in attics or cupboards of the children or grandchildren of the people who'd been involved, which took a long time to track them down. And there were some documents that were at the Hoover Institution. I spent a week in Palo Alto at the Hoover Institution archives because one key figure left his papers to them. Why them? I don't know. That's where they were. I got a trip to California out of it. So stuff was scattered all over. And then there was some material, particularly on what was going on in the Yishuv, in the Jewish community in Palestine, that was in archives in Israel. It was fun.
You referred to the New York Times article that was by of a disbelief that the information that was coming out of Germany about and Eastern Europe about the numbers of people that were being killed. At what point during the war was there a recognition of the numbers and an understanding of the gravity of what was going on?
The first information that was considered reliable in government circles was in the autumn of 1942. And that eventually got published was in the autumn of 1942. And that's the point where people began to understand that the term hadn't been invented yet, but that genocide was taking place in Europe, that the Nazis were actively trying to kill all of the Jews of Europe. So it was several months later. But at this point, people didn't know about it. And actually, the late Israeli writer Uriav Neri said to me that one of the reasons that when the first information began to come out, like these reports in June, that people treated them doubtfully is that during World War I, British propaganda had published exaggerated reports of German atrocities. So when these reports started coming out, there was a natural inclination to treat it as more propaganda. Or at least that was his explanation of the disbelief. That does not mean that people weren't terrified. But when you read the internal discussions of the leaders of the Yeshuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, it is completely clear that they did not know, or that, okay, there were certain figures who said there was a whole debate about how much to fight, about how much resistance to put up, like whether, if you put up resistance, does that mean all of us will get killed? And then there were like people who had only come from Europe recently who said, all of us are going to get killed anyway, of course we have to put up resistance. But the very fact that the debate could be going on at the end of June 1942 shows how little they knew of what was actually going on in Europe. And I'm just going to add one more detail, or one more perspective on that, which is we always tend to look back at history knowing the spoilers. And to me, one of the most important and most difficult parts of writing history is to try to put yourself in the position of people who don't know what's going to happen in your next paragraph. Who have no more, these people in June 1942 have no more idea of what's going to happen in July 1942 than you have of what's going to happen in March 2023, and believe me, you have no idea. And if it's important, it will surprise you. And when people read backwards and said, how come they didn't react like this? How come they didn't react like this? Hello, they were human. They didn't know the future. What is to us the past was their future, and they didn't know.
Yeah. I was wondering about the lag time between decoding the message, getting the message, decoding the message, and how they got it back to the commanders. What was the time period? I think you mentioned it in the book, but I can't remember.
Okay, there were several stages. So stage number one is breaking the setting. And that sometimes took hours and sometimes took days. Once you've decoded the message, once you've broken the setting, you have to decode the message, and then you have to translate it. And then you have to make sense out of it, because even after you've translated it, it's in German jargon, referring to German figures, using code names. Sometimes there would be lists. And both the person who sent the message and the person who received the message knew that item number one was, say, fuel, and item number two was, say, water, and item number three was tanks. But they would just write one and a number, and two and a number, and you had to figure out from a series of messages what those lists were. There was this giant card catalog. Remember, there's no databases, right? There's no computer memory. So there was this huge card catalog that was created of every single piece of information that they'd figured out, so that when the next message came through, they could send it to the index room to find out what these things meant. Once you had actually made some sense out of the message, you had to get it to the commander. And the way that this was done was it was sent in, first of all, with Britain's cipher machine. Britain's cipher machine was more difficult to break than Enigma, but far less portable. But the fact that they were also using a cipher machine is part of the whole fear thing. We broke their cipher machine, so it's possible, right? The British did not believe in secure end-to-end encryption because they were the hackers, right? At the other end, it was transmitted to special officers who transmitted the messages, the information, to the generals orally, and were never to get near front lines in order to reduce the chances that somebody who knew the secret was taken captive. By the grace of God, none of them were ever taken captive, and the secret was kept throughout the war. Another problem, which I mentioned, there's two more problems involved here that are worth mentioning. One is convincing the commanders that this is real information. At the beginning, the information was attributed, or actually formally throughout the war, it was attributed to a human source. The problem with that is that the generals knew that human sources were really unreliable. So why should I make decisions based on this? They had to learn that this was really good information. And the final piece of the puzzle is you had to have the means to do something about it. So, for instance, Enigma provided perfect intelligence on the German invasion of Crete, the airborne invasion of Crete. Unfortunately, the British simply didn't have the forces to stop that invasion. The Germans had much heavier losses taking Crete than they would have otherwise. Well, that's a what if. Apparently had much higher losses than they would have otherwise because General Freyberg, the New Zealand general who was in command of British forces in Crete, knew what was going to happen. He simply didn't have the numbers to stop them. So intelligence is always an important but not sufficient factor to change the course of the battle.
Thank you. I just had a couple of questions about numbers. You mentioned that some Jews were interned in Africa, and I was curious how many that was. Beyond that, what was the Jewish population of Egypt and separately Palestine, Israel at that time? And
Okay.
And one last thing, just out of curiosity, how many of the Israelis are European or recent emigres from Europe?
How many of the Jews who were in Palestine at that time were recent immigrants from Europe? Yeah. To answer your last question first, I don't know the breakdown there. There was a large immigration from Germany in the 30s until the British essentially put a cap on it, but I can't give you an exact breakdown. For that matter, I can't give you an exact number for the number of Jews who were in Palestine at that time because the official numbers, like people whose names were known to the authorities, was 500,000, but there had been a lot of illegal immigration. So the estimates are that could have been as many as another 100,000 Jews in Palestine at that time. The reason that the number is unclear is obvious. There were an estimated 75,000 Jews in Egypt. There were 25,000 Jews in Lebanon and Syria. There were over 100,000 Jews in Iraq. Baghdad, at the time that this was happening, was more of a Jewish city than, say, New York is today. It was 1/6 Jewish. There were somewhere in the area of 33,000 Jews in Libya out of a population of, I think, 900,000, of whom 2,600, the population in eastern Libya was smaller. General population and the Jewish population in eastern Libya and Cyrenaica was smaller than in western Libya. There's really no connection between eastern Libya and western Libya except that they were both parts of an Italian colony. If you look at the map, there's this huge empty space between the towns on the either side. But that was the only part of Africa that nobody had colonized, so the Italians took it. Like they got the last bite. So there were about 30 to 33,000. I can't remember whether there were 30 or 33,000 Jews in Libya, and that's obviously an estimate anyway, of whom an estimated 2,600 were sent to Jado, of whom a fifth died of either hunger or typhus in the camp. The camp was liberated, I believe, in January 1943 by Montgomery's advancing army on its way to Tunisia. Now, the interesting thing about Tunisia is that after El Alamein, immediately after the victory at El Alamein, America, for the first time, got troops into action against the Axis on the Western Front. Not in Europe, invading Morocco and Algeria. By the way, giving an incredible, unexpected PR boost to the movie Casablanca. That was in November of 1942. So suddenly, Allied armies are advancing both directions across Africa, and Hitler gave orders to occupy what was up to then Vichy-controlled Tunisia. One of the early German officers to arrive in Tunisia after the German occupation in November of 1942 was Walter Rauff of the SS, whose orders were to begin to carry out the usual measures. The fact that only a few hundred Tunisian Jews, I hate using terms like that, only a few hundred, several hundred Tunisian Jews were killed by the Nazis. Exact numbers depend on how you do the counting. And there's a whole historical debate here that I'm not going to get into, which I don't really think is relevant. The Nazis occupied Tunisia and intended to kill the Jews of Tunisia. My memory is that the numbers were somewhere in the area of 60 to 70,000 Jews were living in Tunisia at the time. Where's Alma? You probably know these numbers better than I do. Okay. This is your expertise, not me. First of all, the Germans were losing control, the Italians were the naval power, were losing control of the Mediterranean because of the Allied advance, which meant that the planes that bombed the ships could get closer to the shipping lines. So their intention to take the Jews of Tunisia and ship them to the camps in Europe, they couldn't carry out. And basically, the Nazi control of Tunisia was weak and failing from the beginning, because from early 1943, Eisenhower's forces from the west and Montgomery's forces from the east were attacking Tunisia and trying to work their way up that peninsula until in May of 1943, Tunis fell, which was the stepping stone to invading Sicily, which was the stepping stone to the real first Allied invasion of Europe, which was Italy in September of 1943. So once again, Pearl Harbor, Normandy, we won is like way too simple. But the real story is, as horrible as it is, absolutely fascinating.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you tracked down the people that you interviewed, like how you found them, or, you know, their descendants.
Oh my gosh.
Just a little bit.
Okay. First of all, you hope for weird names. Somebody's name is John Smith, like, okay. So let's take, for instance, Margaret Story. Unfortunately, Story happens to be, S-T-O-R-E-Y, happens to be a fairly common name. And not only that, there is apparently a famous British children's writer whose name is Margaret Story. So every time I Googled Margaret Story, I came up with these children's books. However, certain documents showed that she continued working for GCHQ after the war. There was a 15-volume top secret history of naval intelligence at Bletchley Park that was written at the beginning of the 50s. Only one of those volumes had a single author who was a female, and that was Margaret Story. I knew that GCHQ had moved to a town called Cheltenham. It turned out, as I prayed, that there was a Cheltenham Local Historical Society, and that they published a printed little newsletter once a quarter. So I wrote to them and I said, could you please run an ad that anybody who knew Margaret's story, I'm trying to find out about her. And the wonderful volunteer at the Historical Society said, I can do that, and I can also download for you from the British Registry her last will and testament. So two people who had known her at GCHQ, in fact, responded and talked to me. There were 4 heirs. She was childless, but she left her money she came from this family that had become fabulously wealthy during the Industrial Revolution. She left her small fortune to 4 people, 2 of whom had names like John Smith, and 2 of whom had names that I thought I could find. And I started searching, Googling whatever. There was one that 2 people came up with that name in England, and I wrote to both of them. There was one name that I couldn't find an email, but she had a Facebook page, and the Facebook page list, and she didn't respond to my Facebook message, but the Facebook page showed the name of her son and daughter-in-law who had Facebook pages, and I wrote to both of them. And the son and daughter-in-law, it turned out, were in Australia. And the daughter-in-law passed the message to the mother-in-law, who got in touch with me, and who told me that if Margaret Story visited your house and went out into the garden, she identified the flowers and the birds by their Latin names, and that she spoke 9 languages. So like that's like one trail. There's a figure who worked with, who was Margaret's mentor, a guy named Russell Dudley Smith, again, horribly common name. People should have names like Gorenberg or Rumpelstiltskin, then you can find them. But some document gave the name of his wife. Now, for some reason or other, Joan Dudley Smith was less common. And that popped up, to my great dismay, in a funeral notice from a parish in a town outside of London. So I wrote to the parish, and I said, can you tell me the next of kin? And they said, we can't, but the funeral home could do so. And they gave me the next, he had one daughter who had married some guy with a Welsh name. Thank you, because that name was really unusual in the phone book for that area. And I called her, and I went to her house to talk to her about Dad. And I said, if you have any papers from him, I'd like to see them. He says, oh, she says, I have a couple cardboard boxes with some papers in it. We pull out the papers and we start, she had taken out of his house, his apartment when he passed away, and never looked at. We pull out the papers, and she said, Dad wrote poetry? And like there was this whole intellectual, emotional history of him from before he joined Bletchley Park that was hidden in these papers. Oh, I love those days. It took a long time to find her. And I could give you more. I mean, a lot of these searches took many months to find people.
Thank you. How long did it take you to actually write the book? And separate, how long do you think you spent researching it from the time you got your original enthusiasm?
Well, the conversation with Danny was in the spring of 2013. I researched until the summer of 2018, which is when I started writing. I finished writing at the very beginning of 2020. That was slowed down a little bit by my teaching at, no, it was slowed down a lot. During the semesters I was teaching at Columbia, I really didn't have enough time to write. A friend of mine said to me, you think you're going to write a book while you're here? You might have time to read a book, which turned out to be too accurate. But if I take out the months teaching, I probably spent a little more than one insane year writing. And all I have to say is that my wife is a saint.
Probably have time for 2 more questions.
How about a quick footnote? Were you doing anything else besides teaching and writing when you were starting this book?
I was writing a monthly column for the Washington Post and a bi-monthly column for the American Prospect and occasional other pieces. One thing that I was not doing very much of was sleeping. One thing that I did a little too much of was breaking my arm in a bicycle accident a month before deadline, which slightly got in the way of meeting deadline, but, you know, life is life.
Hello. I was just wondering if you could give an example of Margaret's sense of humor and her top secret documents.
Oh, well, I would have to really dig in my computer to find it, but what I discovered in the archives was she had written a rhymed parody of her own report. And it was lovely. It was really, really funny. It had a distribution group of 12 people. The same 12 people who got her other reports, because who else would understand the joke anyway? And nobody who knew her knew that she had, it was, I mean, okay, there was this whole thing, you know, custom of like these rhyme ditties that were done at celebrations and you know, end of year ceremonies or whatever, which lives on, interestingly enough, in Israeli culture. But she wrote one of these things, and it was, I mean, I got a great laugh out of it, but I was probably the 13th person to read it. But her relatives didn't know that. And one of the joys was that after the book came out, I got an email from one of those heirs whose name was untraceable, who I hadn't looked for in the English phone books because there was going to be too many of them, and I wouldn't have found them because he was in Australia. And he said, "We're gobsmacked. Our Margaret did that?" So that was cool.
Last question, anyone? Oh, okay.
How did the code breakers know the difference between the French name for Germany, which is Alamein, and Alamein near Cairo? How did they know the difference?
I don't know, but what I would tell you is that when I saw the decoded messages, actually, Alamein, the decoded messages that I saw before they got to Alamein, there was only like one mention of Alamein because they didn't expect to fight there, but it was spelled as Alamein. How did they know that that was different? I don't know. Probably because it was referring to a place in Egypt and not to France. I mean, there's a part of making sense of these messages. I'm thinking this out as I'm answering you. Part of making sense of these messages is context. This is an Air Force message. We're looking for words about planes and fuel and things like that. We're not looking for words about, I don't know, tanks. I mean, that's part. There are two stages of the decoding. The first stage is making it into German words. The second stage is making sense out of those German words. And there was this incredible quote from one of the code breakers in one of these later historical volumes that says, "We were eavesdropping on a country on a foreign country." You know, we didn't, even once we decoded it, it was this tremendous effort to make sense of things. So that was one more thing to make sense of, like those lists that didn't tell you what they were lists of, or the message doesn't say that it's from headquarters to Rommel. It says that it's from this code name to that code name. And then there'd be these long documents saying, we think that this code name is this general. And you know what, they switched, it seems that in June they switched code names, so now that code name seems to mean somebody else. And that was part of the process. That's why you needed brilliant people like Margaret Story to try to make sense out of all this, even beyond the code breaking. That the code breaking wasn't the only thing that you had to be astounding in order to do. Thank you so much.